What, in your opinion, are the main challenges that we face in the aftermath of the global economic crisis?
Let me step back a little bit and give you some sort of background numbers to put the global financial crisis in context. There was a study done in the IMF a few years back that looked at the fiscal accounts for a very large number of countries, over a period of 1975 to I think 2006. And what they discovered actually is that globally, the budget deficit in the global economy was in excess of 3% of GDP. Now, there are many good reasons why sometimes countries can have budget deficits, right? If there is a recession and revenue comes down and unemployment compensation goes up, inevitably there may be a temporary budget deficit. Or if your country is a commodity exporter and there is a terms of trade loss, and your exports decline, your budget revenues associated with trading activities may also decline. And countries may face emergencies and calamities which require a response from the government, through increased public spending and so on. But the fact that globally, all over the world, we have been running consistently budget deficits for the last 40 years, and needless to say, this process has been intensified since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, suggests that there is something else going on, that there are other factors beyond those that I have mentioned, which explain why we have this kind of deficit bias, this proclivity for fiscal indiscipline. Now, what the financial crisis did is basically it contributed to a kind of a very remarkable worsening of the public sector accounts. In the advanced economies, for instance, if you go back to 2007, we were running a deficit of something like 2% of GDP. By 2009, it was 9% of GDP, a budget deficit that we had not seen since World War II, essentially. The IMF has done some calculations, and they say that public debt levels in the advanced economies were something like 73% of GDP in 2007, but by 2018 they're going to be 104% of GDP. And if under some sort of assumptions, but if you make the assumptions a little tougher, if you assume, for instance, that the global economy is going to grow less quickly, which means that your denominator is going to grow less quickly, then these debt ratios could go to 125, 130, 135% of GDP, which is, again, we haven't seen these levels of debt since World War II. In fact, we have wartime levels of debt, without a war. All right. Now, there are some people who would argue and say, but look, we have seen this before, and it's true. If you go back, for instance, to the United Kingdom after the end of World War II, public debt was, I think, 272% of GDP. In other words, sky high, much higher even than it is today. And yet, over the next several decades, this debt was reduced very, very quickly. There was good economic growth. There was, a little bit of inflation as well. Good budgetary management, and debt levels came down to much more sustainable levels, around 50% of GDP. Right. The reason I worry is because this kind of favorable environment that we saw in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s and so on, I don't think is going to come back today. And there are reasons for that, which I will go to in a minute. The problem with high public indebtedness is that it creates a kind of a dilemma for governments. If your debt is very high, then basically you have to allocate a fairly substantial level of resources for debt service, which means that then there is less money to go to education, less money to go to, all those things that, contribute to boost economic growth and enhance, the efficiency of the economy. There is also kind of a loss of sovereignty, which is interesting. This has a kind of a political dimension, but when your debts are very high, then you become a captive to shifts in market sentiment. Then decisions actually, are no longer made wholly in your capital. Sometimes they are done in the bond markets in New York and in London and so on. So you become a captive to these, to forces which very often you cannot control. One thing that comes incidentally, before I continue and address the issue of the long-term challenges, this issue of high indebtedness is not simply a problem of the advanced economies, after the crisis of 2008, 2009. Economists would tend to agree that developing countries, that prudent levels of debt in developing countries are lower than in advanced economies, essentially because they have financial markets that are much less sophisticated and much less deep, and also because the advanced economies have a longer history of better debt management in general. And some of the advanced economies are much more able to issue debt in their own currency, for instance, which is not something that developing countries can always do, although that has improved in recent years. Now, in terms of the long term and some of the challenges that we face after the financial crisis, I think one of them has to do with the aging of populations, sort of certain demographic trends which basically are contributing to the graying of populations, not just in Europe and in Japan, which are typically the countries that we think of, the areas that we think of when we think of Asian populations, but actually this is happening gradually in Brazil, in Mexico, in Indonesia, in Poland, in China in a very important way. The cost of pensions and medical care is going to increase in a very significant way, in coming years, more or less, depending on the country that you look at. We talk about the baby boom. This is 78 million Americans were born in the United States between 1946 and 1964. These people are beginning to retire from 2011. And so you're going to have, fairly significant burden put on budgets over the medium term. Furthermore, we don't know with certainty what are going to be the budgetary implications associated with climate change. We have some, emerging evidence. For instance, we know that the destruction caused by Sandy a little more than a year ago in New York and New Jersey costed something like $60 billion. That was the fiscal implication of addressing, the implications of the hurricane. But we know that climate change is going to lead to a lot of instability, especially in the developing countries. The developing countries are, in many ways, many of them are located in the tropics. They are countries where agriculture is much more important than in the advanced economies, and agriculture is going to be particularly affected by climate change. Many of these countries are poor countries, which means they have less resources for interventions, when something happens, whether it is a typhoon or a hurricane or some, extreme weather event. So what the combined effect on the budgets is going to be associated with climate change, we don't know, but we know that it is going to have some kind of implications. A couple of final points. That when we look at the health of companies, we look at two documents. We look at the income statement, which basically shows revenues and expenditures, and of course we also look at the balance sheet, which shows assets and liabilities. If you are an investor, you would not invest certainly heavily in a company if you didn't have access to both documents. You also want to know, how indebted is the company, what sort of obligations does it have over the longer term. When we look at fiscal issues and we look at countries, we tend to look at the income statement only, which is the budget, and we very often don't look at the balance statement, which is basically, the obligations that the state will have, into the future, into the indefinite future. When you do that exercise, when you, for instance, calculate, you add the net present value, of pension and medical expenses, that are projected to take place, for the foreseeable future, you emerge with a picture that is dramatically different in many ways. Without going into specifics, there are many countries which today seem to have an okay budgetary situation, but yet when you do this accounting of the net present value of future liabilities, they are insolvent. They are insolvent on present policies. So I think that these are some of the issues that we need to confront and that are a direct consequence of the financial crisis, because the response to the financial crisis was in the end a remarkable increase in levels of public indebtedness.